My name is Vanessa Miller, and at 32, I thought I understood the rhythms of Jade Mountain Hospital in Greenstone Valley, Oregon. As a registered nurse in the cardiac telemetry unit, I'd spent 4 years navigating the sterile corridors, the constant hum of monitors, and the delicate balance of patient care that defined our 12-hour shifts. The hospital sat nestled against the foothills, its windows offering glimpses of pine-covered slopes that seemed to promise stability and healing. The first sign something was wrong came during a Tuesday morning huddle in March. Our unit manager, Brianna Mitchell-Torres, was reviewing committee assignments for the upcoming quality improvement initiatives. I'd submitted my application weeks earlier for the Patient Safety Committee, along with my interest in joining the new Diabetes Education Task Force. My background in endocrine nursing made me a natural fit, and I'd been looking to expanding my role beyond bedside care. The committee rosters are finalized, Brianna announced, scrolling through her tablet. She read through the names methodically, her voice echoing in the small conference room where we gathered each morning. My name wasn't called for either committee. I approached her after the huddle, assuming there'd been an oversight. Brianna, I think there might be a mistake with the committee assignments. I didn't hear my name for patient safety or the diabetes task force. She glanced up from her notes, her expression neutral but somehow distant. The positions were filled by more experienced candidates, Vanessa. Perhaps next quarter. The response felt rehearsed, hollow. I'd been at Jade Mountain longer than 3 of the nurses who'd been selected. My performance reviews consistently rated me as exceeding expectations, and I'd recently completed additional certification in diabetes management. The dismissal stung, but I attributed it to hospital politics and moved on. 2 weeks later, during our monthly staff meeting, the diabetes educator presented updates on patient education protocols. Noah Mitchell-Barnes had been with the hospital for 8 years, building the diabetes program from a small patient education service into a comprehensive care model that other facilities often toured to study. His reputation was impeccable, his knowledge encyclopedic. When he'd recommended me for my current position during my transfer from the medical surgical unit 2 years ago, it had felt like professional validation. That afternoon, I noticed him speaking quietly with Brianna near the nurses' station. Their conversation stopped abruptly when I approached to check on a patient's glucose monitoring schedule. Noah's smile seemed forced, and Brianna excused herself immediately, claiming she had urgent emails to address. The pattern continued over the following weeks. Conversations that ceased when I entered rooms. Meetings I wasn't informed about until after they'd concluded. Training opportunities that somehow bypassed me despite my expressed interest and qualifications. The hospital's EPIC system showed my access credentials were current, my continuing education requirements met, my patient satisfaction scores consistently high. Yet opportunities seemed to evaporate whenever I reached for them. During a particularly busy Thursday evening shift, I was updating patient charts when I overheard 2 nurses from the emergency department discussing the new diabetes protocol implementation team. They mentioned Noah's enthusiasm for the project and how he'd specifically requested certain nurses for the pilot program. My name hadn't been mentioned, despite my recent completion of the advanced diabetes management course that the hospital had partially funded. The exclusion felt deliberate now, calculated. I began paying closer attention to the subtle dynamics around me, the way certain colleagues seemed to know about initiatives before they were formally announced, the way my suggestions during staff meetings were acknowledged, but never seemed to gain traction. The breaking point came on a quiet Sunday morning in early May. I was reviewing the previous week's committee minutes that had been posted to our internal portal, trying to understand how decisions were being made about patient care protocols I'd be expected to implement. The Diabetes Task Force had already met 3 times, developing new education materials and screening procedures that would directly impact my daily work with cardiac patients who often had comorbid diabetes. As I scrolled through the meeting notes, I found something that made my hands still on the keyboard. In the third meeting's minutes, there was a brief mention of staffing considerations and ensuring appropriate team composition for optimal outcomes. The language was bureaucratic, sanitized, but the implication was clear. Someone had influenced these decisions. Someone had been working behind the scenes to shape my professional trajectory. The morning sun streamed through the break room windows, casting long shadows across the empty tables. The hospital felt different now, the familiar sounds of monitors and overhead pages taking on an ominous quality. I'd always prided myself on being observant, on reading the subtle cues that made the difference between good nursing and exceptional patient care. Now I realized I'd been missing the most important signals of all. Something was happening at Jade Mountain Hospital, something that involved my career, my reputation, and my future. The question was no longer whether I was being deliberately excluded from opportunities. The question was who was orchestrating it, and why. The silence in the break room felt heavy with unspoken truths, and I knew my comfortable assumptions about trust and professional integrity were about to be shattered. The realization that something was systematically wrong didn't come all at once. It built slowly over the following weeks, like the gradual onset of symptoms that experienced nurses learn to recognize before they become critical. My relationship with Brianna Mitchell, our diabetes educator, went back 3 years to when I first arrived at Jade Mountain Hospital. She'd been the one to recommend me for my current position when I transferred units from general medical surgical to cardiac care. At the time, I'd been grateful for her advocacy. Brianna had a reputation for being thorough, dedicated, and politically savvy in the best sense. Someone who knew how to navigate hospital administration to benefit patient care. "Vanessa, you have exactly the kind of clinical thinking we need in cardiac," she'd told me during my transition interview. "Your attention to detail and patient education skills would be perfect for our diabetic cardiac patients. They're some of our most complex cases." She'd been right. The position had been challenging and rewarding, allowing me to develop specialized expertise in managing patients with both cardiac and endocrine conditions. Brianna and I worked closely together, consulting on cases where patients needed both cardiac monitoring and diabetes management. She'd become more than a colleague. I'd considered her a mentor and friend. That's what made the growing pattern of exclusion so confusing and painful. It started with small things. The monthly cardiac care committee meetings that I'd been attending regularly for 2 years suddenly had scheduling conflicts with my shifts. When I mentioned this to our unit manager, Noah Mitchell, he seemed genuinely surprised. "That's odd, Vanessa. Let me check with administration about the scheduling. We definitely need your input on these protocols." But the conflicts continued. When I requested schedule adjustments to attend, I was told that staffing requirements made it impossible. Meanwhile, other nurses seemed to have no trouble getting coverage for professional development activities. Then there were the quality improvement initiatives. Our hospital was implementing new protocols for diabetic patient education, something that should have been directly relevant to my work. I learned about the project not through official channels, but from overhearing a conversation between 2 physicians in the hallway. "The new diabetes education protocols are really comprehensive," Dr. Catherine Mitchell was saying to Dr. Noah Mitchell. "Brianna's done excellent work coordinating with the cardiac team." I approached Brianna later that day, curious about my role in the implementation. "Oh, Vanessa, I meant to talk to you about that," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "The timeline got accelerated, and we needed to move quickly with a smaller team. But don't worry, once we have the framework established, we'll definitely want your input on the cardiac-specific components." The explanation felt reasonable, but something about her tone was off. Brianna was usually direct and enthusiastic when discussing patient care initiatives. This felt rehearsed, careful. Over the next month, I noticed more exclusions. A research study on cardiac outcomes in diabetic patients that I should have been involved in. A presentation opportunity at the regional nursing conference that went to a colleague with less experience in the relevant area. Training sessions for new Epic system features that somehow never made it to my schedule. Each incident had a plausible explanation. Budget constraints, scheduling conflicts, last-minute changes. But the pattern was becoming undeniable. The most telling moment came during a staff meeting in late May. Our nurse manager was discussing upcoming changes to patient education protocols, and I raised a question about coordination between cardiac and endocrine care plans. "That's a great point, Vanessa," Noah Mitchell said. "Brianna, didn't you mention having some thoughts about that integration?" Brianna nodded smoothly. "Yes, we've been working on standardizing those handoff procedures. The diabetes education team has developed some new tools that should help with continuity of care. She went on to describe initiatives that sounded remarkably similar to suggestions I'd made in previous meetings and in informal conversations with her. The language was different, but the core concepts were identical, ideas I'd developed through my daily work with patients who struggled to manage both conditions. After the meeting, I approached her privately. "Brianna, those coordination protocols you mentioned, they sound a lot like the ideas we discussed last month about improving patient understanding of medication interactions." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Great minds think alike, I suppose. It's wonderful when we all arrive at similar conclusions independently. The dismissal was subtle but unmistakable. My contributions were being absorbed, repackaged, and presented without attribution. Worse, I was being systematically excluded from the forums where I could advocate for my own ideas and expertise. That evening, I sat in my apartment overlooking the Greenstone Valley, trying to make sense of what was happening. The mountains in the distance were shrouded in the kind of mist that made everything look uncertain, boundaries blurred. I'd always believed that healthcare was fundamentally collaborative. Yes, there was competition for positions and recognition, but ultimately we were all working toward the same goal: better patient outcomes. The idea that a colleague, especially one I trusted, might be deliberately undermining my professional development felt almost incomprehensible. But the whole was mounting. The next week brought confirmation that shattered any remaining doubt. I was working a late shift when I needed to access the shared drive to review updated protocols for a complex patient case. As I navigated through the folders, I accidentally opened a directory I didn't recognize, administrative files that weren't typically accessible to floor nurses. Among the documents was a folder labeled Committee Composition Reviews. Curious, and thinking it might contain information about the scheduling conflicts I'd been experiencing, I opened it. What I found made my breath catch. There were email chains discussing staffing for various committees and initiatives. My name appeared multiple times, but not in the way I'd expected. In one exchange from 3 weeks earlier, Brianna had written to several administrators. "While Vanessa Miller has strong clinical skills, I have concerns about her readiness for expanded leadership roles. Her approach to patient education sometimes lacks the nuanced understanding needed for our diabetic population. I'd recommend focusing on candidates with more specialized experience for the upcoming initiatives." Another email, dated just days after I'd shared my ideas about medication coordination protocols. "I think we need to be careful about implementing suggestions that haven't been thoroughly vetted through proper channels. Some of the recent proposals, while well-intentioned, might create confusion rather than clarity for our patients." The language was professional, measured, but the intent was clear. Brianna was systematically undermining my credibility and blocking my involvement in professional development opportunities. She was using her position and reputation to paint me as inexperienced and potentially harmful to patient care. The betrayal cut deeper than I'd expected. This wasn't just professional sabotage, it was personal. She'd used our friendship, our collaborative relationship, to gather information about my ideas and then present them as concerns about my competence. I sat in the empty break room, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, trying to process what I'd discovered. The hospital around me felt different now, the familiar environment suddenly foreign and threatening. How long had this been going on? How many opportunities had I lost? How many of my ideas had been appropriated while my reputation was quietly being damaged? The worst part was the calculated nature of it all. Brianna hadn't acted impulsively or out of momentary jealousy. This was a sustained campaign, carefully orchestrated to advance her own position while limiting mine. She'd used her role as diabetes educator to position herself as the expert on integrated care, building her reputation on ideas and insights that weren't entirely her own. As I finally logged off the computer and prepared to finish my shift, I realized that my comfortable world of professional trust and collaboration had been an illusion. The real question now was what I was going to do about it. The night shift was ending, and the morning staff would be arriving soon. Among them would be Brianna, ready to start another day of patient care and professional development. Development that had been built, at least in part, on the systematic sabotage of my career. I had now, but was just the beginning. The real challenge would be deciding how to confront a betrayal that had been hiding in plain sight, disguised as mentorship and friendship. The next morning arrived with the usual chaos of shift change, but everything felt different now. I watched Brianna Mitchell arrive at her usual time, her professional demeanor intact, as she greeted colleagues and reviewed her patient assignments. She moved through the Diabetes Education Center with the same confidence she'd always displayed, completely unaware that her carefully constructed facade was about to crumble. I'd spent the remainder of my night shift documenting everything I'd discovered, creating a timeline of incidents and collecting the email. The hospital's employee handbook was clear about reporting procedures for professional misconduct, but I knew this wouldn't be a simple matter of filing a complaint. Brianna had built relationships throughout the hospital administration, and her reputation as an innovative educator preceded her. My first stop was Noah Mitchell's office. No relation to Brianna, despite the shared surname. As the Quality Improvement Director, he oversaw professional development initiatives and would be the appropriate person to handle allegations of sabotage within hospital committees. I'd worked with him on several projects and respected his methodical approach to problem solving. "Vanessa, come in," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "You mentioned this was urgent." I placed the printed emails and my documentation on his desk. "I've discovered that Brianna Mitchell has been systematically undermining my involvement in hospital committees and quality initiatives. She's been presenting my ideas as her own while simultaneously questioning my competence to administration." Noah's expression remained neutral as he reviewed the materials, but I could see the concern growing in his eyes. The emails were damning, clear of deliberate sabotage disguised as professional concern. "This is serious, Vanessa. These allegations, if substantiated, represent a significant breach of professional ethics." He leaned back in his chair, processing the implications. "I'll need to initiate a formal investigation, which means involving human resources and potentially the chief medical officer." The investigation process was more complex than I'd anticipated. Within hours of my meeting with Noah, I was called to HR for an initial interview. Catherine Mitchell, the HR director, explained that they would need to conduct interviews with multiple staff members and review all relevant communications and committee records. "I want you to understand that this process will likely take several weeks," Catherine explained. "During this time, both you and Brianna will continue your regular duties, but there may be some temporary adjustments to committee assignments to avoid conflicts." The most challenging aspect was maintaining professional composure while working alongside Brianna. She seemed to sense that something had shifted, occasionally glancing at me with a puzzled expression during our brief interactions. The Diabetes Education Center felt charged with unspoken, and I found myself analyzing every conversation for hidden meanings. 3 days into the investigation, I received an unexpected ally. Diana Mitchell, a nurse manager from the cardiac unit, approached me during my lunch break. We'd collaborated on several quality improvement projects, and I'd always respected her direct communication style. "Vanessa, I heard about the investigation," she said quietly, settling into the chair across from me in the cafeteria. "I want you to know that I've had my own concerns about some of the committee dynamics lately." Diana explained that she'd noticed inconsistencies in how ideas were attributed during recent quality meetings. There were several instances where Brianna presented concepts that sounded remarkably similar to discussions we'd had in smaller working groups, discussions where you'd been the primary contributor. Her validation was both relieving and disturbing. If Diana had noticed the pattern, others might have as well. The scope of Brianna's manipulation was becoming clearer, and it extended beyond just my direct interactions with her. "Would you be willing to speak with the investigation team?" I asked. "I already have," Diana replied. "Noah contacted me yesterday. I think they're being very thorough." The investigation intensified over the following week. I was interviewed twice more, each session focusing on specific incidents and timelines. The investigators were particularly interested in the diabetes care protocol development, where the idea appropriation was most clear. Meanwhile, the atmosphere in the hospital began to shift subtly. Word of the investigation had spread, despite efforts to keep it confidential. I noticed colleagues treating me with a mixture of sympathy and curiosity, while others seemed to maintain careful neutrality. The professional relationships I'd built over years felt suddenly fragile and uncertain. Brianna's behavior became increasingly erratic as the investigation progressed. She began avoiding common areas where we might encounter each other, and her usually confident demeanor showed cracks of anxiety. During one particularly tense moment in the medication room, she attempted to engage me in conversation about a patient case, but her words felt forced and artificial. "Vanessa, I hope you know that I've always supported your professional development," she said, her voice carrying an undertone of desperation. "If there's been any misunderstanding about committee work, I'm sure we can resolve it directly." I maintained my professional composure, responding only with necessary clinical information. The investigation was ongoing, and any direct confrontation could complicate the process. But her attempt at reconciliation felt hollow, especially given the mounting of her systematic sabotage. The breakthrough came during the second week of the investigation. Noah called me to his office with an update that would change everything. "We've completed our review of the committee records and email communications," he began, his expression serious. "This supports your allegations. We found multiple instances where Brianna presented your ideas without attribution, while simultaneously raising unfounded concerns about your competence to administration." He handed me a summary of their findings. The documentation was comprehensive, showing a clear pattern of professional sabotage that extended back over 8 months. The investigators had also discovered that Brianna had been in communication with external professional organizations, promoting herself for speaking opportunities using concepts and protocols that originated from our collaborative work. "What happens now?" I asked. "Brianna will be meeting with administration this afternoon. Given the severity of the misconduct and the impact on hospital operations and staff development, disciplinary action is inevitable. The exact consequences will depend on her response to the findings." The resolution came swiftly after that meeting. Brianna was placed on administrative leave pending a final review by the hospital's ethics committee. Her access to committee communications was immediately revoked, and her involvement in quality improvement initiatives was suspended. The news spread through the hospital quickly, creating a mixture of shock and vindication among staff who had witnessed the dynamics but hadn't understood the full scope of the situation. Several colleagues approached me privately to express support and share their own observations about the committee processes, but the victory felt complicated. While justice was being served, the betrayal had damaged more than just my professional opportunities. It had shattered my trust in collaborative relationships and forced me to question the authenticity of other professional connections. As I finished my shift that evening, walking through the familiar corridors of Jade Mountain Hospital, I realized that, while the investigation had ended, the real work of rebuilding my professional confidence was just beginning.